Miss Marple and the Parish Hall, where laughter turned to screams, the St. Mary Mead Parish Hall had never looked more inviting than it did on that crisp October evening. Strings of fairy lights adorned the entrance, casting a warm glow over the cobblestones, and the scent of Mrs. Bantry's famous apple tarts wafted from the refreshment table inside. The village's annual amateur theatrical production was finally ready for its debut performance, and it seemed the entire population had turned out to witness the spectacle. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her knitted shawl as she took her seat in the third row, her keen blue eyes surveying the gathering with the same gentle interest she might apply to watching birds in her garden. She had declined a role in the production, far too much memorization for an old woman. She'd demurred, but had been pleased to help Mrs. Price with the costumes, a task that had given her ample opportunity to observe the cast during rehearsals. Evening, Miss Marple. Raymond West, her nephew, slid into the seat beside her, slightly out of breath. Nearly missed the curtain. London traffic was beastly. "How thoughtful of you to come all this way, dear," Miss Marple said, patting his hand. "Though I did mention the performance was Saturday, not Friday." Raymond laughed. "You know me hopeless with dates. Still, wouldn't miss it for the world. I've heard this production has been quite the drama behind the scenes." Indeed it had. Miss Marple had witnessed more than a few heated exchanges during costume fittings. The leading lady, Vivian Ashford, a striking woman in her early 40s who'd recently moved to the village from London, had proven rather difficult to please. Then there was the matter of Gerald Thornberry, the local bank manager who'd been cast as the romantic lead, much to the displeasure of his wife Constance, who felt the role should have gone to someone younger and less prominent in village life. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the audience. The curtain rose to reveal a Victorian drawing room, meticulously crafted by the art teacher, Mr. Pemberton, and his students. The play, a light melodrama, titled Shadows of Deceit, promised romance, betrayal, and a thrilling climax. For the first 2 acts, everything proceeded admirably. Vivian Ashford commanded the stage with professional grace that seemed almost too polished for a village production, while Gerald Thornberry delivered his lines with surprising competence. Young Timothy Graves, the vicar's nephew visiting from Cambridge, played the villain with theatrical menace that drew appreciative murmurs from the audience. During the interval, Miss Marple noticed several interesting exchanges. Constance Thornberry stood rigid by the refreshment table, her teacup rattling slightly in its saucer as she watched her husband receive congratulations. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, appeared to be having an intense, hushed conversation with Vivian Ashford near the stage door. And Mr. Pemberton, usually so jovial, seemed oddly distracted, checking his pocket watch repeatedly. "Everything all right, Miss Marple?" asked Colonel Melchett, the chief constable, who'd taken the seat in front of her. "You're looking rather thoughtful." "Oh, just wool gathering, I'm afraid," she replied with her characteristic vague smile. "It's a most entertaining production, don't you think?" The third act began with renewed energy. The plot had thickened considerably, with accusations flying and secrets being revealed. The climactic scene approached, the moment when Vivian's character was to discover the villain's treachery and confront him before the assembled party guests. The stage lights had been dimmed for dramatic effect, with only a single spotlight illuminating the center stage. Vivian made her entrance, resplendent in the crimson gown Miss Marple had helped alter just 3 days prior. She delivered her lines with piercing intensity, building to the moment of revelation. And then, quite suddenly, she faltered. Her hand went to her throat, her eyes widening with what seemed, for a moment, to be simply extraordinary acting. But Miss Marple, with her long experience of human nature, recognized immediately that something was terribly wrong. Vivian staggered, knocking against the prop table. The crash echoed through the hall. Several audience members laughed nervously, assuming it was part of the performance. Timothy Graves, in character, reached out to steady her, but she fell to her knees, gasping for breath. The laughter died as her gasps became strangled. Gerald Thornberry broke character, rushing to her side. Vivian, what's wrong?" Dr. Haydock was already pushing through the crowd. His medical bag, which Miss Marple noted he'd brought, despite this being a social occasion, clutched in his hand. He reached the stage just as Vivian Ashford collapsed completely, her crimson dress spreading around her like a pool of blood. The doctor knelt beside her, his face growing grave as he checked for vital signs. The parish hall, so recently filled with laughter and applause, had fallen into shocked silence. After what seemed an eternity, but was likely less than 2 minutes, Dr. Haydock looked up, his expression grim. "I'm afraid," he said quietly, though his voice carried to every corner of the hall, "that Miss Ashford is dead." Pandemonium erupted. Someone screamed. Mrs. Price fainted into the arms of the churchwarden. Colonel Melchett was already making his way to the stage, barking orders for everyone to remain calm and stay where they were. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap, but her mind was already working. She had noticed several things in those final moments, small details that others might have overlooked in the confusion. The way Vivian had clutched at her throat before even delivering her line. The expression on Dr. Haydock's face as he'd watched from the wings. The glass of water that had been sitting on the prop table, catching the light just before Vivian had knocked against it. And she had noticed something else, something that struck her as particularly significant during those crucial moments, when everyone's attention was riveted on the dying woman. One person had been looking not at the stage, but at the audience, with an expression of careful calculation. Yes, Miss Marple thought, settling her shawl more firmly around her shoulders as police constables began cordoning off the stage. This was going to require some very careful observation indeed, for if she wasn't very much mistaken, and long experience had taught her that she rarely was, they had just witnessed not a tragic accident, but a cold-blooded murder. By morning, the death of Vivian Ashford had become the sole topic of conversation in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, making her customary early trip to the greengrocer's, found herself privy to no fewer than 7 distinct theories about what had transpired, each delivered with absolute certainty. "Mark my words," declared Mrs. Bunch, the postmistress, leaning across the counter with the air of someone sharing state secrets. It was her heart. These theatrical types, always overexciting themselves. "My cousin's neighbor's sister saw Sarah Bernhardt herself collapse on stage, and it was exactly the same." "Nonsense," countered Miss Hartnell, who prided herself on being up to date with modern thinking. "It was clearly some sort of seizure. I read about them in the medical journal just last month. Very sudden, very tragic, and quite beyond anyone's control." Miss Marple made appropriately sympathetic noises while carefully selecting her vegetables, noting that neither theory accounted for the expression of surprise and betrayal she'd observed on Vivian Ashford's face in those final moments at the butcher's shop. She encountered a different perspective entirely. Young Mrs. Dane, wife of the new solicitor, was holding forth to a captive audience. "Well, I hate to speak ill of the dead," she began, in the tone of someone who is about to do precisely that. "But everyone knows Miss Ashford had something of a past. London society, you know. There were rumors about debts, unsuitable associations. I wouldn't be at all surprised if something from her former life had caught up with her." "Really, Mrs. Dane?" protested elderly Miss Weatherby. "That seems rather fantastical. This is St. Mary Mead, not a penny dreadful, is it?" Mrs. Dane raised her eyebrows meaningfully. "Then why was Inspector Slack here at 7 this morning, asking questions about poisons?" This revelation caused a satisfying stir, and Miss Marple filed away the information with interest. Poison, then. That narrowed the field considerably and suggested premeditation rather than impulse by the time she arrived at Miss Maple's no relation. Despite the similar name tea shop for her morning refreshment, the theories had evolved further still. Colonel Bantry was there with his wife, and both looked rather shaken. The thing is, Colonel Bantry was saying to Dr. Haydock, who sat hunched over his coffee with the air of a man who'd had very little sleep, nobody really knew her, did they? 6 months in the village, and she kept herself rather apart. Friendly enough on the surface, but private. Some people prefer their own company, Dr. Haydock replied shortly. Nothing suspicious in that. No, quite right, the colonel agreed hastily. Still, it does make one wonder. What brought her to St. Mary Mead in the first place? London actress, by all accounts, giving it up for village life. Seems odd. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. I heard from Mrs. Price that Vivian had been asking quite pointed questions about various villagers. Wanted to know who was who, what they did, how long they'd been here. Almost as if she were investigating something. Investigating what? Demanded Miss Hartnell, who had just bustled in and caught the end of this pronouncement. Are you suggesting she was some sort of detective? Or perhaps a blackmailer? The word hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Bantry looked uncomfortable. I'm not suggesting anything of the sort. I'm merely repeating what Mrs. Price told me. Mrs. Price has an overactive imagination, Dr. Haydock said firmly. As, frankly, do most of you. A woman has died tragically, and within 12 hours. You've turned her into a figure from a sensation novel. But Miss Marple, stirring sugar into her tea with slow, thoughtful movements, remembered something. 3 weeks ago, she'd encountered Vivian Ashford in the lending library. The younger woman had been researching old newspapers, going back some 15 years. When Miss Marple had politely inquired about her interest, Vivian had smiled and said she was simply fascinated by local history. At the time, it had seemed a reasonable enough explanation. Now, however, it took on a different complexion entirely. The arrival of Inspector Slack himself interrupted the speculation. He was a solidly built man with a red face and a manner that suggested he was perpetually irritated by the world's refusal to organize itself along more logical lines. Dr. Haydock, if you please, he said brusquely. We need your official statement, and Colonel Melchett wants to see you immediately. As the doctor rose wearily to follow him, Inspector Slacks, I fell on Miss Marple. Ah, Miss Marple, I'll need to speak with you as well. You were present last evening, I understand. Indeed I was, Inspector. Such a dreadful occurrence. Yes, well, dreadful or not, we need facts. He pulled out his notebook. I'm told you helped with the costumes. That means you were backstage during rehearsals. Did you notice anything unusual? Anyone with a grudge against the deceased? Miss Marple considered this carefully. A grudge is such a strong word, Inspector. Though I couldn't help but notice that Miss Ashford seemed to make people uncomfortable. Uncomfortable how? Oh, nothing I could put my finger on precisely. Just that when she spoke with people, she had a way of asking questions that seemed quite innocent on the surface, but made them rather defensive. Mr. Pemberton, for instance, became quite flustered when she asked about his time teaching in Surrey before he came here, and young Timothy Graves nearly walked out of a rehearsal when she mentioned she'd once lived near his family's estate. Inspector Slack's pen moved rapidly across his notebook. Anyone else? Well, Miss Marple said delicately, there was some tension between Miss Ashford and Mrs. Thornberry. Though that's hardly surprising given that Gerald Thornberry was playing opposite her in rather romantic scenes. Wives do sometimes find that sort of thing trying, don't they? Rather like my niece's husband in the village play at home. His wife was quite put out when he had to kiss the leading lady, even though it was all perfectly innocent. I see, Inspector Slack's tone suggested he found village theatrical jealousies beneath his notice, and the victim's personal life. Friends, confidants. She seemed friendly with Dr. Haydock, Miss Marple observed. They'd occasionally take walks together, and I saw him visiting her cottage on several occasions. The inspector's eyes sharpened. Did you indeed? Professional visits, perhaps. I really couldn't say, Inspector, though she did seem in perfect health. She mentioned to me once that she hadn't needed a doctor in years. After Inspector Slack had departed, taking Dr. Haydock with him, the tea shop erupted with renewed speculation. Mrs. Bantry was particularly animated. A doctor would have access to all sorts of medicines and poisons, wouldn't he? And if there was some sort of romantic entanglement, Dr. Haydock has served this village for 20 years with nothing but dedication and integrity. The very idea is absurd. But Miss Marple noticed that even Miss Weatherby looked troubled. A doctor with access to poisons and a personal connection to the victim was, after all, difficult to dismiss entirely. And there had been something in the way Dr. Haydock had looked at Vivian Ashford during the interval concern. Certainly, but perhaps something more. Guilt, fear. As she walked home through the autumn morning, past gardens where chrysanthemums bloomed in defiant riot against the approaching winter, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar position of being the person everyone told things to precisely because they assumed she understood nothing. The village had already decided on several suspects and a dozen motives, most of them probably wrong. But somewhere in all the gossip, speculation, and wild theories, there were grains of truth. The trick was learning to separate them from the chaff, and Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing human nature in all its complicated, contradictory glory, knew exactly how to begin. The official inquest was set for 3 days hence. But Inspector Slack was clearly not a man to wait idly. By afternoon, he had interviewed half the village and irritated the other half with his brusque manner and leading questions, Mrs. Marple spent the afternoon in her garden, ostensibly deadheading roses, but positioned where she had an excellent view of the comings and goings at the parish hall. The building remained cordoned off with police tape, and she watched with interest as various officials came and went. Her observations were interrupted by the arrival of her nephew, Raymond, who found her contemplating a particularly stubborn black spot on one of her prized hybrid teas. "Aunt Jane, you look positively conspiratorial," he said, kissing her cheek. "Don't tell me you're planning to solve this mystery yourself." "My dear boy, what an extraordinary suggestion. I'm simply maintaining my garden, while coincidentally observing the crime scene with the dedication of a Scotland Yard detective." Raymond grinned. "Come now, I know that look. You've noticed something, haven't you?" Miss Marple relented, setting down her pruning shears. "Perhaps one or two small things. Would you be so kind? I need to return a book to Mrs. Price, and the walk would do me good." Mrs. Price, the costume mistress and general busybody of St. Mary Mead, lived in a cottage whose interior resembled nothing so much as a well-organized warehouse. Bolts of fabric competed for space with dress forms, sewing machines, and boxes of buttons and trim. Miss Marple. "How lovely to see you," Mrs. Price exclaimed, ushering them in. "And your nephew, too. You'll have heard about poor dear Vivian, of course. Such a shock. I've been quite beside myself. The police actually questioned me this morning, if you can imagine. Me. As if I would harm anyone, let alone someone I was working so closely with. How distressing for you," Miss Marple sympathized, accepting a cup of tea. "You must have known Miss Ashford better than most, given all the costume fittings." "Well, I wouldn't say I knew her exactly. She was rather reserved, you know. Polite, certainly, and very appreciative of my work, but not one for personal conversation." Mrs. Price leaned forward. "Though I must tell you, I did notice something odd," Raymond prompted. "The evening of the performance, Vivian arrived earlier around 6 o'clock to get into costume. I helped her with the crimson gown, and I distinctly remember checking that everything was perfect. She looked absolutely stunning." Mrs. Price's eyes filled with tears. "And now, to think that was the dress she died in." "Most distressing," Miss Marple agreed gently, "though I'm sure you did beautiful work. Thank you. But here's the thing, after I'd finished helping her, she went to the green room to rest before the performance. I went to attend to young Timothy's costume. His collar had come loose. When I returned to check on Vivian, about 45 minutes later, I noticed something peculiar. Yes, there was a teacup on the dressing table that hadn't been there before. I'm quite certain of it, because I'd placed all the refreshments in the main refreshment area, not in the green room. Someone had brought her tea." Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her eyes sharpened. "Did you happen to see who might have done so?" "No, but it was odd. The tea was barely touched, just a sip or two, and Vivian seemed restless. She asked me if I'd seen anyone near her dressing area, which I thought was a strange question at the time. After extracting a few more details and offering appropriate sympathies, Miss Marple and Raymond made their way back through the village. They passed the police station, where Inspector Slack was visible through the window, apparently having what looked like a heated discussion with Colonel Melchett. "That teacup," Raymond said thoughtfully. "You think that's significant? Perhaps. Or perhaps it was simply tea." Miss Marple paused to admire someone's garden. though I do wonder what happened to the cup. Mrs. Price didn't mention seeing it after the performance. Their next stop was the lending library, where Miss Marple had remembered she needed to return several books. The librarian, Miss Bunting, was a precise woman who kept meticulous records of what everyone in the village read. "Dreadful business about Miss Ashford," she said, scanning Miss Marple's returns. "The police were here this morning, asking about her library records. I told them I couldn't possibly divulge such information without proper authority." "Quite right. Researching in the newspaper archives," Miss Bunting sniffed. Yes, she was quite interested in the local history. Specifically, she requested newspapers from 15 years ago, the summer of 1940. I found it curious because that was a rather unremarkable period in St. Mary Mead. The war was going on, of course, but nothing particularly happened here. 1940, Miss Marple murmured. How specific, indeed. And she seemed particularly interested in the social pages announcements of engagements, marriages, that sort of thing. I remember because she asked me if I recalled any particular scandals from that period. "And did you?" Miss Bunting considered. "There was the Pemberton affair, I suppose, though calling it a scandal is rather overstating things. Mr. Pemberton, our art teacher, came to the village in 1941, just after his wife left him rather suddenly. There were whispers that she'd run off with someone, though I never gave credence to such gossip." Raymond and Miss Marple exchanged glances. Mr. Pemberton, who had been backstage throughout the performance, their final stop was the chemist's shop, where Miss Marple needed to collect a prescription for her rheumatism. The chemist, Mr. Dilk, was a fussy man who prided himself on discretion. "Terrible thing," he said, carefully counting out Miss Marple's tablets. "The inspector was asking me about what sort of poisons someone might get hold of. I told him that, in a properly run establishment like mine, such things are carefully controlled." "I'm sure they are," Miss Marple said, "though I imagine there are other sources." "Well, yes. Common household items can be deadly if misused, even garden pesticides. And then there's the medical profession, of course. Doctors have access to all sorts of dangerous substances." "Dr. Haydock, you mean?" Mr. Dilk looked uncomfortable. "I'm not making accusations, Miss Marple, but yes, any doctor would have access to medications that could be lethal. Morphine, digitalis, any number of things." As they walked home in the lengthening shadows, Raymond was thoughtful. "So we have a victim who was researching the village's past, particularly events from 15 years ago. We have a mysterious teacup that's gone missing. We have a doctor who might have had access to poison and who seemed personally involved with the victim. And we have Mr. Pemberton, whose past she was apparently interested in. Don't forget Mrs. Thornberry's jealousy," Miss Marple added, "or young Timothy Graves, who became agitated when his family was mentioned. Good Lord, Aunt Jane, half the village had motives." "Perhaps." Miss Marple unlocked her front door, stepping into the familiar comfort of her sitting room, "though I've learned that the true motive is often the simplest one, hiding in plain sight while everyone chases after more dramatic possibilities." She moved to her desk, where she kept her knitting and correspondence, and pulled out a small notebook. Raymond watched with amusement as she began making careful notes. "What is it you always say about human nature?" he asked. "That it's much the same everywhere, dear. The same patterns repeat themselves, whether in a village like St. Mary Mead or in the stories from newspapers and books. Someone who would betray a friend in one context would do so in another. Someone who would lie to avoid embarrassment would lie to avoid suspicion. She looked up, her blue eyes sharp despite her age. And someone who would kill once would kill again if they felt threatened. You really do think it was murder, then? Oh yes, Miss Marple said quietly. I'm quite certain of that. The question is not whether Vivian Ashford was murdered, but who had both the means and the opportunity, and, crucially, what she had discovered that made her death necessary. She returned to her notes, and Raymond, knowing better than to disturb her when she had that particular expression, quietly let himself out. As the evening darkened into night, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the lights of St. Mary Mead flicker on one by one, and contemplated the patterns of human behavior that were as reliable as the turning of the seasons. Somewhere in this village, a murderer was sleeping, or perhaps, more likely, lying awake and wondering if they had been clever enough, careful enough, to escape detection. Miss Marple intended to ensure they had not. Inspector Slack called an informal gathering at the parish hall the following morning, requesting that all those involved in the production attend. The hall, stripped of its theatrical decorations and morning light streaming through the windows, looked vastly different from the enchanted space it had been 3 nights ago. Miss Marple arrived early, securing a seat near the back where she could observe everyone. Raymond, who had extended his visit to keep her company, and she suspected, because he was thoroughly enjoying the unfolding mystery, sat beside her. Colonel Melchett stood at the front of the room, looking every inch the military officer, despite his retirement. Thank you all for coming. I know this is difficult, but the inspector needs to clarify a few points. Dr. Haydock has provided his preliminary findings. Dr. Haydock stepped forward, his face drawn. He'd clearly aged 10 years in the past 3 days. The post-mortem reveals that Miss Ashford died from acute cardiac arrest brought on by digoxin poisoning. Digoxin is a heart medication, quite beneficial in proper doses, but lethal when concentrated. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Price clutched her handkerchief to her mouth. Even Colonel Bantry, usually unflappable, looked disturbed. Inspector Slack took over, his expression grim. This is now officially a murder investigation. Someone administered a fatal dose of digoxin to Miss Ashford sometime before or during the performance. Dr. Haydock, perhaps you could explain the timeline. Digoxin typically takes 30 to 90 minutes to produce symptoms, Dr. Haydock said quietly. Given that Miss Ashford collapsed approximately 2 hours after arriving at the hall, the poison was likely administered sometime between 6 and 7 o'clock. And who had access to her during that time? Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. Mrs. Price, you helped her with her costume at 6 o'clock. Yes, Inspector. Then she went to the green room to rest, alone, as far as I know. Though people were coming and going, it's always chaotic before a performance. Inspector Slack's gaze moved around the room. Now, here's an interesting fact. Digoxin is not a common poison. It's not something you'd find in your average household. However, he paused for effect. It is something a doctor would have ready access to. The implication hung in the air like a thundercloud. All eyes turned to Dr. Haydock, who'd gone very pale. That's absurd, he said, his voice tight. I've served this community for 20 years, and you had a personal relationship with the deceased, didn't you, Doctor? Inspector Slack pressed. You were seen visiting her cottage on multiple occasions, taking walks with her, having what appeared to be intimate conversations. We were friends, nothing more, really. Because Mrs. Thornberry reported seeing you arguing with Miss Ashford just before the performance. Something about not being able to continue this way. Dr. Haydock's jaw worked. That was taken out of context. Vivian was unwell nervous about the performance. I was merely suggesting she might want to withdraw if she wasn't feeling up to it. Convenient that she's no longer here to confirm that, Inspector Slack said coldly. This is ridiculous. Dr. Haydock burst out. Why would I murder her? What possible motive could I have? That's what we're trying to determine, Dr. Doe. I understand she'd been asking rather pointed questions about your past. Questions about your time in London before you came to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple watched the doctor's face carefully. There was fear there, yes, but also something else, desperation, perhaps, but not guilt. At least, not guilt about murder. Inspector Colonel Melchett interrupted. I really must protest. Dr. Haydock is a respected member of this community. You can't simply accuse him without evidence. I'm not accusing anyone yet, Colonel. I'm merely establishing facts. Inspector Slack turned back to the room. However, given the nature of the poison and Dr. Haydock's access both to it and to the victim, I'm afraid I must ask him to remain available for further questioning. The doctor is not to leave the village. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Several people rushed to Dr. Haydock's defense, while others whispered behind their hands. Miss Marple noticed Timothy Graves slipping out the back door, his face troubled. She also observed that Gerald Thornberry looked oddly relieved, while his wife Constance appeared positively triumphant. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple made her way slowly toward the front, where Colonel Melchett was speaking in low tones to Inspector Slack. Miss Marple, the Colonel, acknowledged her with a nod. I suppose you have thoughts on all this? Oh, I'm sure my thoughts are of no consequence, Colonel. Though I couldn't help but notice that Inspector Slack seems very certain Dr. Haydock is guilty. The evidence does rather point that way, Inspector Slack said defensively. He had means, opportunity, and he's hiding something about his relationship with the victim. Yes, he's definitely hiding something, Miss Marple agreed. Though I wonder if it's actually murder. You see, it reminds me very much of a situation we had in my village years ago. There was a doctor, very respected, very professional, who became quite involved with helping a young woman overcome a difficult period in her life. People assumed the worst, naturally, but it turned out he was simply trying to protect her from something in her past, something that had nothing to do with any romantic entanglement. You're suggesting Dr. Haydock was protecting Miss Ashford? Colonel Melchett asked. I'm not suggesting anything, Colonel. I'm merely noting that protective behavior and guilty behavior can sometimes appear very similar to the casual observer. Inspector Slack snorted. With all due respect, Miss Marple, this isn't one of your village parables. This is a murder investigation, and Dr. Haydock had the best access to the poison that killed her. Did he, though? Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. Digoxin is prescribed for heart conditions, as Dr. Haydock said, which means any patient receiving that medication would have it in their home. And in a village this size, I imagine several people are being treated for heart problems. This observation gave Inspector Slack pause. Are you suggesting someone else with access to digoxin committed the murder? I'm not suggesting anything specific, Inspector. though I do think it might be worth determining who in the village is currently being prescribed DIGA. Not every murderer is a doctor, after all. Sometimes there's simply someone clever enough to realize that a doctor would make an excellent scapegoat. Raymond, who had been listening to this exchange with poorly concealed amusement, caught his aunt's eye. She gave him the slightest nod, and they made their excuses to leave outside. The autumn sun was warm despite the crisp air. They walked slowly through the churchyard, where tombstones leaned at various angles, marking generations of St. Mary Mead residents. "You don't think Dr. Haydock did it?" Raymond stated. "No, I don't. He's hiding something, certainly, but not murder." "Did you notice his reaction when Inspector Slack mentioned Vivian, asking about his past? It wasn't fear of being exposed as a murderer, was fear of a secret being revealed." "What sort of secret?" "I'm not entirely sure yet, but I intend to find out." Miss Marple paused at a grave marker, her expression thoughtful. "You know, Raymond, the problem with obvious suspects is that they're often too obvious. Real murderers don't usually draw attention to themselves. They're much more subtle. So who are your less obvious suspects?" "Well, we have Mr. Pemberton, whose past Vivian was researching. We have Timothy Graves, who became agitated when his family was mentioned. We have the Thornberrys. Gerald was playing opposite Vivian in romantic scenes, and Constance was clearly jealous. And then there's the question of what Vivian discovered in those newspaper archives. You think her death is connected to something that happened 15 years ago?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Vivian Ashford came to St. Mary Mead for a specific reason. She was looking for something, or someone, and whatever she found got her killed." They had reached the edge of the churchyard when Miss Marple noticed something. Mr. Pemberton was standing by a grave in the far corner, his head bowed. It wasn't a recent grave doll. Stone was weathered with age, dating back to 1941. "How curious," Miss Marple murmured. "Come along, Raymond. I think it's time we learned a bit more about Mr. Pemberton's history in St. Mary Mead." As they walked back toward the village, Miss Marple reflected on the way people saw what they expected to see. Inspector Slack expected the doctor to be guilty because doctors had access to poison. The village expected scandal because V had been beautiful and somewhat mysterious. Mrs. Thornberry expected betrayal because her husband was acting opposite an attractive woman. But Miss Marple had spent a lifetime looking past the obvious to see what people were really thinking, really feeling, really hiding. And right now, she was certain of one thing. Dr. Haydock might be the most obvious suspect, but he wasn't the most dangerous one. The most dangerous suspect was the one everyone was overlooking, the one who was content to let the doctor take the blame while they remained safely in the shadows, and Miss Marple was determined to bring them into the light. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright. The kind of autumn day that makes one forget winter is approaching. Miss Marple attended the morning service at St. Mary's Church, where the Reverend Clement delivered a thoughtful sermon on the nature of truth and deception. Whether intentionally or not, his words seemed particularly relevant to current events. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the sunshine, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Mrs. Thornberry. The banker's wife was dressed in severe black, despite not having been especially close to the deceased. "Such a tragedy," Mrs. Thornberry said, though her tone lacked genuine sympathy. "Though I must say, I'm not entirely surprised," Miss Marple prompted gently. "Well, a woman like that coming from London, putting herself forward, flirting with married men. It was bound to end badly." Mrs. Thornberry's mouth set in a thin line. "Gerald tells me the police are focusing on Dr. Haydock. I can't say I'm shocked. A doctor should know better than to become entangled with an unsuitable woman." "Gerald must have found it all very distressing," Miss Marple observed. "Playing opposite Miss Ashford in such romantic scenes, and then her dying so suddenly. He's naturally upset. Though between you and me, Miss Marple, I think he was rather relieved when it was over." Mrs. Thornberry leaned closer. Those rehearsals were becoming quite uncomfortable. Vivian had a way of making the scenes more intimate than the script required. This was interesting, really. I wouldn't have thought the play was particularly romantic. It wasn't meant to be. But Vivian would improvise, adding touches and looks that weren't in the direction. Poor Gerald was quite flustered. He's a banker, not an actor. He's not equipped to deal with that sort of thing. After extricating herself from Mrs. Thornberry, Miss Marple made her way to the parish hall. Inspector Slack had finally removed the police tape, and she'd volunteered to help Mrs. Price sort through the costumes and props that remained from the production. Mrs. Price was already there, looking overwhelmed by the task ahead. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank goodness. I've been dreading this. Every time I look at that crimson dress," she trailed off, eyes welling with tears. "Why don't we start with something else?" Miss Marple suggested gently. "Perhaps the props. They'll need to be packed away properly." They worked in companionable silence for a while, Miss Marple carefully examining each item as she packed it. The prop table had been a key element of the final scene. It was where Vivian had stumbled, knocking items over as she fell. "Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said casually, "you mentioned there was a teacup in the green room before the performance. Did the police ever find it?" "Not that I know of. Inspector Slack asked about it, but I couldn't tell him what happened to it. Someone must have moved it during all the confusion, I see." Miss Marple picked up a prop book, its pages yellowed with age. "And the glass of water that was on this prop table, was that part of the set dressing?" "Water glass?" Mrs. Price looked confused. "There wasn't supposed to be a water glass. Just the prop items specified in the script: a letter opener, some papers, and a decorative box." "How strange. I distinctly remember seeing a glass of water here just before Miss Ashford collapsed. It caught the light, you see, which is why I noticed it." Mrs. Price frowned. "Are you sure? Because that would mean someone put it there during the performance." They exchanged meaningful looks. Miss Marple continued her careful examination of the prop table's contents. That's when she noticed something odd: a very faint ring mark on the wooden surface, the kind a wet glass would leave. And beside it, barely visible, was a small stain that looked suspiciously like tea. "Mrs. Price, could you bring me that magnifying glass from the costume box? My eyes aren't what they used to be." Under magnification, the stain was definitely tea. And more importantly, Miss Marple could see tiny crystalline residues mixed with its residues that didn't look quite right for ordinary tea. "We need to tell Inspector Slack about this," Mrs. Price said, alarmed. "In a moment. First, I'd like to understand the full picture." Miss Marple sat back thoughtfully. "You see, this table was positioned stage right, near the wings. Anyone in the cast or crew could have placed a glass here without being noticed by the audience. But who would have reason to do so? But why put water or tea here at all? It wasn't part of the scene, exactly, unless Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Unless it was meant for Miss Ashford to drink during the performance. You said she'd been given tea in the green room earlier, which she barely touched. What if someone wanted to ensure she received a larger dose of poison? You mean they tried twice? Mrs. Price gasped. Or they wanted to make sure the poison took effect at precisely the right moment. If the first attempt with the tea in the green room didn't work quickly enough, a second dose during the performance would ensure the timing was right. Miss Marple stood, dusting off her skirt. Mrs. Price, I want you to think very carefully. During the final act, were you watching the stage, or were you in the wings? The wings, mostly. I needed to be available in case anyone had a costume emergency. And did you see anyone approach this prop table? Mrs. Price closed her eyes, concentrating. There were several people moving about. Timothy Graves was pacing, nervous about his villain speech. Mr. Pemberton was adjusting the lighting. Gerald Thornberry was waiting for his entrance. Anyone else? Constance Thornberry was there too, which was odd because she wasn't in the cast. She said she wanted to watch from the wings. This was very interesting indeed. Miss Marple made a mental note, and Dr. Haydock. He was in the audience until Vivian collapsed. I remember because I saw him push through the crowd to get to the stage after, ensuring Mrs. Price would speak to Inspector Slack about the glass and the stains. Miss Marple made her way back home. But instead of taking the direct route, she detoured past Vivian Ashford's cottage, charming thatched roof building at the edge of the village. The cottage stood empty now, its windows dark. Miss Marple knew the police had searched it, but she wondered what they'd been looking for. More importantly, she wondered what they'd missed. Raymond found her standing at the cottage gate, staring thoughtfully at the building. Aunt Jane, you look like you've had a revelation. Not a revelation exactly, dear. More of a confirmation. Tell me, what do you know about the art of misdirection? It's what magicians use, isn't it? Making you look at one hand while the other performs the trick. Precisely. And I believe we've all been misdirected very cleverly. We've been so focused on Dr. Haydock, the obvious suspect with access to poison, that we haven't paid attention to the real clues, which are the missing teacup from the green room, the water glass that appeared on the prop table, the fact that Vivian was researching events from 15 years ago, and the curious coincidence that Mr. Pemberton came to St. Mary Mead in 1941, just after his wife left him. Raymond's eyes widened. You think Mr. Pemberton is involved? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that Vivian discovered something about someone's past, something serious enough to warrant murder. And I think that person was desperate enough to try twice, just to make sure she died at the right moment for maximum confusion. But why during the performance? Why not somewhere private? Because, Miss Marple said, turning to face her nephew, a public death creates chaos. Multiple suspects, multiple opportunities, and everyone's attention focused on the dramatic moment, rather than the careful preparation that led to it. It's actually quite clever, in a horrible way. She began walking back toward home, her mind working through the puzzle pieces. The murderer wanted us to focus on the death itself, the dramatic collapse, the poisoning, the obvious suspects. But the real story is in those weeks before, when Vivian was researching and asking questions. That's when she signed her own death warrant. So, what do we do now? Now, Miss Marple said with quiet determination, we find out what Vivian discovered. And to do that, we need to visit the newspaper archives ourselves. As they walked through the dappled sunlight filtering through autumn leaves, Miss Marple reflected on how often people missed the small details, the ring mark on a table, the missing cup, the pattern of someone's research. They saw the big gestures, the dramatic moments, but not the quiet preparations that made those moments possible. The murderer had been very careful, very clever, but they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed no one would notice the small things. They hadn't counted on Miss Marple. Monday morning found Miss Marple and Raymond at the lending library. Miss Bunting having grudgingly granted them access to the newspaper archives. Though I can't imagine what you expect to find that Miss Ashford didn't, she sniffed. Miss Marple settled herself at the reading table with the bound volumes from summer, 1940. Sometimes, my dear Miss Bunting, it helps to know what one is looking for. Raymond pulled up a chair beside her. And what exactly are we looking for? I'm not entirely certain. But Vivian was interested in engagements and marriages, which suggests she was tracing a relationship. Let's start there. They worked through the society pages methodically. June and July were filled with the usual announcements: the Hendersons' silver anniversary, the Wickham engagement, various garden parties and charity drives. Then, in the August 12th edition, Miss Marple stopped. Raymond, look at this. The announcement was modest. Mr. Robert Pemberton and Miss Catherine Hartley to wed, September 14th, 1940. At St. Mary's Church, St. Mary Mead. Pemberton, Raymond breathed. So he was married here. Indeed. And according to Miss Bunting, his wife left him the following year. But look at this. She turned to the September pages. No wedding announcement, nothing about the actual ceremony. They continued searching and found a small notice in the October 3rd edition. The marriage of Mr. Robert Pemberton and Miss Catherine Hartley, scheduled for September 14th, has been postponed indefinitely due to unexpected circumstances. She didn't just leave him, Raymond said slowly. She left him before they were even married. Quite so. And now, let's see what happened next. Miss Marple turned to the 1941 editions. In January, they found another notice. Mr. Robert Pemberton has accepted the position of art master at St. Mary Mead School. Mr. Pemberton comes to us from Surrey and will be taking up residence at Rose Cottage. No mention of a wife, Raymond observed. No. And you'll notice he's described as coming from Surrey, not London. I wonder. Miss Marple's fingers flew through the pages. Ah, here we are. July 1941. The inquest into the death of Miss Catherine Hartley. Found deceased at her London residence on June 28th. Has returned a verdict of suicide by poison. The words hung in the air. Raymond stared at the faded newsprint. Good Lord, his fiancée killed herself, or so the inquest determined. Miss Marple's tone was thoughtful, though one does wonder about the coincidence. A woman dies by poison 15 years ago. And now another woman who was researching that death has also died by poison. You think Pemberton killed both of them? I think Vivian Ashford suspected something. And I think she confronted the wrong person with those suspicions. They packed up the newspapers carefully. As they left the library, Miss Marple noticed Mr. Pemberton himself walking toward the school. His shoulders hunched, looking years older than he had just days ago. "Raymond, I need you to do something for me. Go to the police station and tell Inspector Slack what we've found. Give him the dates and names. Tell him to request the full inquest file on Catherine Hartley's death. Where will you be?" "I'm going to have a conversation with Mr. Pemberton. Someone needs to give him the chance to explain himself before Inspector Slack arrests him." Raymond looked alarmed. "Is that wise? If he is a murderer, we're in the middle of a village in broad daylight. I'll be perfectly safe. Besides, I rather think Mr. Pemberton has been waiting for someone to ask him about all this. The burden of 15 years of secrets can be quite heavy." She found Mr. Pemberton in the school's art room, mechanically organizing supplies that didn't need organizing. He looked up as she entered, and she saw resignation in his eyes. "Miss Marple, I wondered when someone would come. May I sit down, Mr. Pemberton? Please." He gestured to a student chair. "I assume you've been to the library." Vivian went through those same newspapers. She was very thorough. "Why don't you tell me what really happened?" Miss Marple said gently. "I find the truth is often less damning than what people imagine." Mr. Pemberton was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "Catherine and I were engaged to be married in September 1940. We'd known each other since childhood. Our families were neighbors in Surrey. Everyone assumed we'd marry someday, and we did too. It seemed inevitable." He paused, gathering his thoughts. But as the wedding approached, Catherine became increasingly anxious. She kept postponing decisions, putting off arrangements. "I thought it was just nerves." Then, 2 weeks before the wedding, she came to me in tears. She said she couldn't marry me. She was in love with someone else. "How difficult for you both." It was devastating. But what made it worse was who she loved. Thomas Ashford, a married man, a prominent surgeon in London with a wife and position. Catherine had been his patient, and they'd become involved. She wanted to call off our wedding, but she knew it would cause a scandal. Her family was very traditional, very strict. The shame would have destroyed them. Miss Marple's expression remained neutral, but her mind was racing. Thomas Ashford. Would that be any relation to Vivian? Her father? Mr. Pemberton's laugh was bitter. That's why she came to St. Mary Mead. She'd found letters between her father and Catherine. She'd known her father had an affair years ago, before her mother died, but she didn't know the details. When she discovered Catherine had died shortly after the affair ended, she became convinced her father had murdered her to prevent a scandal, and she came here to prove it. She came here to understand what happened. She thought I might have answers. She thought I might have killed Catherine out of jealousy or anger. He met Miss Marple's eyes. But I didn't. Catherine killed herself. I found her body. She left a note saying she couldn't live with the guilt and shame. She'd broken off with Thomas. Ashford. He'd made it clear he would never leave his wife, and she couldn't face marrying me while loving someone else. That must have been terrible for you. It was. I came here to start over, to get away from the memories. I never married. I couldn't. His voice cracked. And then Vivian arrived, asking questions, digging up the past. I told her the truth, Miss Marple. I showed her the note Catherine left. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. No. Vivian seemed satisfied at first, but then she started asking about other people in the village. She wanted to know who else had been here in 1940, who else might have known her father. She was convinced someone was hiding something, that there was more to the story, and was there. Mr. Pemberton shrugged helplessly. I don't know, but someone clearly thought so. Someone who was willing to kill to keep the past buried. Miss Marple stood, smoothing her skirt. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Pemberton. I don't believe you killed anyone, but I do believe you've been carrying a terrible burden all these years. Will you tell the police? They'll know soon enough, but I'll make sure they understand the truth. She paused at the door. One question. Did you tell anyone about your conversation with Vivian? About what she was investigating? Yes. I was upset after she left, and I ran into Dr. Haydock. I told him Vivian had been asking about Catherine and the affair. I thought he might speak to her, help her understand she was chasing shadows. I see. Miss Marple's tone was carefully neutral. And when was this? About a week before the performance. Oh, just gathering facts, Mr. Pemberton. Just gathering facts. As she left the school, Miss Marple's mind was working furiously. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but there was still something missing, some crucial connection she hadn't yet made. Dr. Haydock had known what Vivian was investigating. He'd known about the affair between Thomas Ashford and Catherine Hartley, and he'd been seen arguing with Vivian before the performance. But was he protecting himself, or protecting someone else? Miss Marple needed more information, and she knew exactly where to find it. The doctor's surgery was quiet when she arrived, the waiting room empty. Dr. Haydock looked up from his desk, his face gaunt with stress. Miss Marple, I suppose you're here to interrogate me, too. I'm here to help you, Dr. Haydock, because I don't believe you killed Vivian Ashford. But I do believe you know who did. The doctor's face crumbled. For a long moment, he said nothing, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I've been such a fool, Miss Marple. Such a terrible fool. Tell me, she said gently and slowly, painfully. Dr. Haydock told her a story that changed everything. Dr. Haydock's story emerged in broken fragments, each revelation more devastating than the last. Thomas Ashford was my mentor, he began, his hands trembling as he poured himself a whiskey despite the early hour. I studied under him at London Hospital in the late 1930s. He was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, but he had a weakness. There had been other affairs before Catherine Hartley, though none quite so serious. You knew about the affair. I suspected. Thomas would disappear for hours, become evasive. When Catherine Hartley died, I saw how it affected him. He was devastated, guilt-ridden. His marriage deteriorated, and by 1942, his wife had filed for divorce, quietly of course. Professional disgrace would have been the least of it. In those days, such scandals could destroy careers. What happened to Dr. Ashford? He died in 1943, an accident. Supposedly fell down the stairs in his home after drinking. The inquest ruled it accidental death, but Dr. Haydock's voice trailed off. I always wondered. Miss Marple absorbed this, and when Vivian came to you with questions about her father, I tried to protect his memory. I told her he'd been a good man who'd made mistakes. I urged her to let the past rest. But she was determined to uncover everything to prove her father wasn't the villain she'd been imagining. He met Miss Marple's eyes. I was arguing with her before the performance because she'd discovered something new. Something that terrified her. What had she discovered? She'd found a witness, someone who'd seen Catherine Hartley shortly before her death. Someone who Catherine had confided in about being pressured to end her own life. Dr. Haydock's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Vivian believed Catherine didn't kill herself. She believed Catherine was murdered, and she was going to expose the killer. Before Miss Marple could respond, the door to the surgery burst open. Inspector Slack stood there, his face flushed with excitement and anger. Dr. Haydock, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Vivian Ashford. You have the right to, Inspector. Wait. Miss Marple stood. Dr. Haydock didn't kill her. With respect, Miss Marple, we have evidence. A prescription bottle with Dr. Haydock's name on it. It contained his fingerprints are all over it. Of course they are. It's his prescription bottle. But that doesn't mean he used it to poison Miss Ashford. Miss Marple's voice was firm. Someone planted that bottle to frame him. Miss Marple, please. Inspector Slack's patience was clearly wearing thin. We also have a witness who saw Dr. Haydock near the green room just before the performance, and another who heard him threatening Miss Ashford. I was pleading with her to be careful, Dr. Haydock protested. She was about to accuse someone of murder, someone who'd already killed once. I told her she was putting herself in danger. Very convenient story. Dr. Inspector Slack produced handcuffs. You'll have plenty of time to refine it at the station. As they led Dr. Haydock away, Miss Marple caught his eye. She saw fear there, but also a desperate plea. He was trying to tell her something, but in the chaos, she couldn't determine what. Raymond found her standing in the street outside the surgery, looking troubled. Aunt Jane. I heard they've arrested Dr. Haydock. Yes, which is exactly what someone wants. She turned to him. Raymond, I need you to do something for me. Go to Inspector Slack and tell him to check Dr. Haydock's medical records. Specifically, find out if he has heart problems and whether he's being prescribed digoxin himself. You think he was taking it? I think someone stole his medication. The same person who planted the bottle to frame him. As Raymond hurried off, Miss Marple made her way slowly back toward home, but her route took her past the Thornberry house. She noticed Constance Thornberry in the garden, aggressively deadheading roses with secateurs that looked dangerously sharp on impulse. Miss Marple approached the garden gate. Good afternoon, Mrs. Thornberry. Lovely roses. Constance looked up, her expression guarded. Miss Marple, I suppose you've heard about Dr. Haydock. Indeed, such a shocking development. Is it though? Constance's voice was hard. A man who would carry on with a woman like Vivian Ashford is capable of anything. Gerald and I are just relieved it's over. How is Gerald handling all this? He must be quite shaken, having worked so closely with Miss Ashford. Something flickered across Constance's face. Triumph, perhaps, or vindication. Gerald is fine. Better than fine, actually. He's realized what a lucky escape he had. That woman was poison, Miss Marple. Absolute poison. An interesting choice of words, given the circumstances. Constance's eyes narrowed. What are you implying? Nothing at all. I simply find it curious how quick everyone is to accept Dr. Haydock's guilt, as if they're relieved to have a scapegoat. Or perhaps, Constance said coldly, they're relieved to see justice done. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Miss Marple walked on, her mind troubled. Constance Thornberry's reaction had been odd, too pleased, too satisfied. And that phrase, "that woman was poison," as if Vivian's death had been deserved, even welcome. She was still pondering this when she encountered young Timothy Graves near the village green. He looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Mr. Graves," she called softly, "might I have a word?" He spun around, startled. "Miss Marple." "Ah, yes, of course." They sat on a bench overlooking the duck pond. Timothy kept his eyes fixed on the water, avoiding her gaze. "You seem troubled," Miss Marple observed. "I can't stop thinking about it. About Vivian dying right there on stage. I keep going over everything, wondering if I missed something, if I could have prevented it somehow." "You were backstage during the final act." "Yes. I was nervous about my entrance, pacing around. I saw—" He hesitated. "I saw Dr. Haydock near the green room earlier that evening. He looked upset about something. Did you see anyone else?" "Mrs. Thornberry was in the wings, watching. I thought that was odd, she's not in the production. And Mr. Pemberton was adjusting the lighting, but he kept glancing toward the stage as if he was expecting something." "Expecting what?" "I don't know. But when Vivian collapsed, he didn't look surprised. He looked resigned, as if he'd known it was going to happen." This aligned with what Miss Marple had already deduced, but it didn't solve the puzzle. "Mr. Graves, Vivian asked you about your family, didn't she? About your estate in Hampshire?" Timothy's face went pale. "How did you?" "She was researching connections to Thomas Ashford." "Your family knew him, didn't they?" "My uncle was his business partner. They invested together, ran a private practice. But that was years ago, before I was born. I don't know anything about it." "Doesn't your uncle live in London still?" "He died last year. Heart attack." Timothy's voice was barely audible. "But before he died, he'd been asking questions about that old business. He'd received an anonymous letter suggesting there had been financial irregularities, that Dr. Ashford had embezzled from their practice. An anonymous letter. When, last summer, Uncle said it was probably just someone stirring up trouble, but he was worried. The allegations, if proven, could have ruined the family name." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "Do you still have this letter?" "No, Uncle destroyed it." But Miss Marple, Timothy, finally met her eyes, and she saw fear there. The handwriting was feminine, elegant, just like Vivian's. This was the twist Miss Marple had been waiting for. Vivian hadn't just been investigating her father's affair, she'd been investigating his finances. And someone, somewhere, had been frightened enough by that investigation to commit murder. But who? And more importantly, what connection did they have to St. Mary Mead? As Timothy hurried away, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation, Miss Marple sat by the pond, watching the ducks paddle in lazy circles. The pieces were almost in place. She could feel it, that moment when a mystery shifts from confusion to clarity. Dr. Haydock had been arrested, but he was the wrong suspect. The real murderer was still free, still dangerous. And if Miss Marple wasn't very careful, there might be another victim before this was over. She needed to set a trap, and she knew exactly how to do it. Rising from the bench with renewed purpose, Miss Marple headed toward the Thornberry house. It was time for a very specific conversation, one that would either confirm her suspicions or send her back to the drawing board. But she was quite certain she was right. After all, human nature was remarkably predictable once you understood its patterns. And Miss Marple had spent a lifetime observing those patterns. The murderer had made one critical mistake. They'd assumed an elderly woman asking innocent questions posed no threat. They were about to learn otherwise. That evening, Miss Marple hosted a small gathering at her cottage. She'd invited only a select few: Colonel Melchett, Raymond, Mrs. Price, Gerald, and Constance Thornberry, Mr. Pemberton, and Timothy Graves. Inspector Slack had protested, leaving his prisoner to attend, but Colonel Melchett had insisted. "Miss Marple has something important to share," he'd said firmly, "and I've learned to trust her judgment." They gathered in Miss Marple's comfortable sitting room, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. The atmosphere was tense, suspicious. Everyone knew this wasn't a social call. Miss Marple served tea with her usual gentle courtesy before settling into her favorite chair. "Thank you all for coming. I know you're wondering why I've asked you here. The truth is, I believe I know who murdered Vivian Ashford, and why." She had everyone's complete attention now. Vivian came to St. Mary Mead searching for answers about her father, Thomas Ashford. She'd discovered letters revealing his affair with Catherine Hartley 15 years ago. More importantly, she'd found evidence suggesting financial improprieties in his medical practice. Someone had been embezzling money, and she believed her father was being blackmailed over his affair. Mr. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably. "I told you about Catherine and Thomas. That's not news." "No. But what is news is that Catherine Hartley didn't kill herself. She was murdered, poisoned in fact, by someone who wanted to protect a secret. And that same someone murdered Vivian when she got too close to the truth." "This is all speculation," Constance Thornberry said sharply. "Dr. Haydock has been arrested. The case is closed, is it?" Miss Marple's blue eyes were steely. "Then perhaps you can explain something, Mrs. Thornberry. You were in the wings during the performance, which wasn't your usual position. Mrs. Price mentioned you specifically requested to watch from there." "Why, I wanted to support my husband." "Is that a crime?" "Not at all. But it did give you excellent access to the prop table where the poisoned water was placed." Miss Marple turned to the group. "You see, the murderer tried twice. Once with tea in the green room, which Vivian barely touched, and again with water on the prop table during the performance. The murderer needed to ensure Vivian died at the right time, in the right place, where the chaos would obscure the evidence." "You're accusing me." Constance half rose from her chair, her face flushed. "That's absurd." "Please, sit down, Mrs. Thornberry. I'm not finished." Miss Marple's voice was calm but commanding. "The digoxin used to poison Vivian came from Dr. Haydock's prescription, but Dr. Haydock didn't take it from his own supply. Someone else did. Someone who had access to his surgery and knew exactly what medication to steal." Gerald Thornberry had gone very pale. "Constance has heart problems. She's been seeing Dr. Haydock for years and receiving prescriptions for digoxin," Miss Marple prompted gently. Constance's hands were trembling. "That doesn't prove anything. Lots of people take that medication." "True, but combined with your presence in the wings, your obvious dislike of Vivian, and your access to Dr. Haydock's surgery." Miss Marple paused. "Mrs. Thornberry, you were at the surgery 2 days before the performance, weren't you? For your regular checkup. How did you? Dr. Haydock's appointment book is quite clear. And I imagine if the police check They'll find your fingerprints on more than just your own prescription bottles. The room had fallen deathly silent. Constance Thornberry's face had drained of all color. "This is monstrous," she whispered. "You're trying to frame me to save the doctor." "Actually," Miss Marple said quietly, "I'm trying to prevent another murder. You see, Mrs. Thornberry, I think you killed Catherine Hartley 15 years ago, and I think Vivian was about to prove it." The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. "That's impossible," Gerald protested. "Constance didn't even know Catherine Hartley. We weren't married until 1942, but you were engaged in 1940, weren't you?" Miss Marple interrupted. "I checked the parish records. Your engagement was announced in June 1940, just 2 months before Catherine Hartley's planned wedding to Mr. Pemberton." She turned back to Constance. "You grew up in Surrey, didn't you? The same area as Catherine and Mr. Pemberton. You knew about the affair with Thomas Ashford because you worked as a nurse at London Hospital. You had access to medications, and you had a motive. What motive could I possibly have?" Constance demanded, but her voice wavered. "Revenge. Catherine Hartley wasn't just Thomas Ashford's lover, she was also your younger sister." The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Gerald stared at his wife in horror. "What? You never told me?" "Catherine brought shame on our family," Constance burst out, her composure finally cracking. "She was throwing herself at a married man, breaking her engagement to a decent person, behaving like a common trollop. Our parents were devastated. The disgrace was killing my father." "So you killed her instead," Miss Marple said sadly. "You poisoned her and staged it to look like suicide. You even wrote the note, didn't you? No one questioned it because everyone knew Catherine was distraught." "She deserved it," Constance hissed. "She was destroying everything: her own reputation, the family name, Robert Pemberton's life. Someone had to stop her. And when Vivian started investigating, when she discovered the connection between Catherine Hartley and Constance Hartley, 2 sisters from Surrey, both with nursing training, she was going to ruin everything. Gerald's position at the bank, our standing in the community. After 15 years of building a respectable life, she was going to tear it all down." Constance was standing now, her face twisted with rage and desperation. "I didn't want to kill her, but she wouldn't stop digging. She found old employment records, traced my maiden name, discovered I'd worked at London Hospital. She was going to tell the police I'd murdered Catherine." "So you decided to kill her first," Colonel Melchett said, his voice hard, "using the same method you'd used before. It would have worked if not for her." Constance pointed at Miss Marple with a shaking finger. "An interfering old woman who can't mind her own business." Inspector Slack, who'd been listening from the doorway with 2 constables, stepped forward. "Constance Thornberry, I'm arresting you for the murder of Vivian Ashford and Catherine Hartley." "Anything you say," but Constance wasn't listening. She'd pulled something from her handbag, a small vial. Before anyone could react, she'd uncapped it and raised it to her lips. "No." Gerald lunged for her, but Miss Marple was faster. Her walking stick, which no one had paid attention to, caught Constance's wrist with surprising force, knocking the vial from her hand. It shattered on the floor, its contents spreading across the carpet. Constance collapsed in her chair, sobbing. "I just wanted a normal life. Was that so wrong? After everything Catherine did, I deserved happiness. I deserved Gerald and respect. And you deserved to face justice, Miss Marple said quietly. Just as Catherine did, just as Vivian did. But you decided you were the one to judge them all. As the constables led Constance away, sobbing, still protesting, the room slowly came back to life. Gerald Thornberry sat stunned, his world shattered. Mr. Pemberton looked both vindicated and heartbroken. Timothy Graves was pale but relieved. Colonel Melchett approached Miss Marple. "How did you know about the vial?" "She's been carrying poison for 15 years, Miss Marple replied simply. "Ever since she killed her sister. It was always her final escape if she were caught. I simply couldn't allow her to use it." "But how did you know she was the murderer?" "The sister connection." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Small things, Colonel. The way she spoke about Vivian with such venomous jealousy, but moral outrage. The way she knew details about the investigation that hadn't been made public, and most tellingly, the way she reacted when Dr. Haydock was arrested. She was too relieved, too satisfied. Real innocence doesn't gloat over another's misfortune." As the gathering dispersed, Raymond helped his aunt clean up the broken vial, carefully using gloves. "What was in it?" he asked. "More digoxin, I imagine. She probably kept some after killing Catherine, just in case. These things have a long shelf life. You took an awful risk, Aunt Jane. What if she'd been faster?" "She wasn't, though. Evil rarely is, in the end." Miss Marple sat down heavily, suddenly looking her age. She spent 15 years thinking she'd gotten away with it, building a new life on top of her sister's grave. When Vivian threatened to expose her, she simply did what she'd done before, moved the threat. But murder has a way of echoing forward, Raymond. One death leads to another, and another, until someone stops it. And you stopped it. Someone had to. She smiled at him. "Now, be a dear, and put the kettle on. I think we could all use some proper tea on, I promise. This time, it's not poisoned." As Raymond headed to the kitchen, Miss Marple gazed into the fire, thinking about Catherine Hartley and Vivian Ashford, two young women whose only crimes had been seeking truth and love, and who'd paid for it with their lives. Justice had been delayed, but it had finally arrived. And in St. Mary Mead, that would have to be enough. The following morning, Inspector Slack released Dr. Haydock with profuse apologies. The doctor, looking 10 years younger despite his ordeal, stopped by Miss Marple's cottage to thank her personally. "I knew Constance was bitter about something in her past," he said, accepting a cup of tea. "She'd make odd comments during appointments about justice and people getting what they deserved. I never imagined." "Few people do," Miss Marple replied. "We see what we expect to see. You expected a respectable banker's wife. You didn't look for a murderer. How did you piece it together? What made you suspect her?" Miss Marple settled back in her chair. "It began with several small inconsistencies. First, there was the matter of timing. Vivian collapsed approximately 2 hours after arriving at the parish hall. Digoxin poisoning typically shows symptoms within 30 to 90 minutes. That meant the poison was administered during the performance itself, not before. She counted off on her fingers. Second, there was the missing teacup from the green room and the water glass that appeared on the prop table. 2 attempts to poison her, suggesting the first hadn't worked quickly enough. Third, Mrs. Thornberry's presence in the wings, which gave her perfect access to both Vivian and the prop table. But what connected her to Catherine Hartley's death 15 years ago? That took longer to determine. But once I understood that Vivian was investigating both her father's affair and potential embezzlement, I realized the murder must be connected to both. Thomas Ashford had an affair with Catherine Hartley. Catherine died by poison, supposedly suicide. But what if it wasn't? Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. And if someone had murdered Catherine, exactly, then that same person would be threatened by Vivian's investigation. I asked myself, who in St. Mary Mead had connections to Surrey, to London Hospital, to the Ashford case? Constance Thornberry fit every requirement, but I needed to confirm the sister connection. How did you do that? Old parish records from Surrey. Raymond helped me track them down. Catherine Hartley had an older sister, Constance, who'd trained as a nurse in London. The same Constance who married Gerald Thornberry in 1942, shortly after her sister's death. She'd changed locations, changed her life, but she couldn't change her past. Raymond entered with a fresh pot of tea. Tell him about the psychology, Aunt Jane. That's the brilliant part. Miss Marple demurred. Oh, I wouldn't say brilliant. Please, Dr. Haydock urged. I'd like to understand. Well, once I knew who the murderer was, I needed to understand why. What drove Constance to kill her own sister? Miss Marple paused, collecting her thoughts. I've observed over the years that people who commit murder for moral reasons, to punish what they see as wickedness, are often the most dangerous. They convince themselves they're doing the right thing, which makes them feel justified in killing. Constance saw Catherine's affair as a moral failing. More than that, she saw it as a betrayal of everything proper and decent. Their family was respectable, traditional. Catherine's behavior threatened their social standing. In Constance's mind, her sister was destroying everything the family had built, so she killed her and staged it as suicide. Precisely. And then she moved to St. Mary Mead, married Gerald, and spent 15 years building the respectable life she felt she deserved. She was the perfect banker's wife, involved in the community, morally upright, slightly judgmental of others. It was all a performance, but she'd convinced herself it was genuine. Dr. Haydock shook his head, and when Vivian threatened to expose her, she reacted the same way she had before. In her mind, Vivian was another threat to the respectable life she'd created, another person who needed to be removed. Miss Marple's voice was sad. The tragedy is that if she'd simply stayed quiet, Vivian might never have connected her to Catherine's death. But murderers often can't help themselves. They have to act, to control, to eliminate threats. It's their nature. What I still don't understand, Raymond interjected, is how she got the digoxin from Dr. Haydock's surgery. That was actually quite simple. She was a patient with heart problems, legitimately prescribed digoxin. She knew where Dr. Haydock kept his samples and medications. During one of her appointments, she simply pocketed a bottle from his personal prescription. Later, she planted it in the parish hall to frame him. The perfect scapegoat, Dr. Haydock said bitterly. A doctor with access to poison and a personal connection to the victim. Indeed, she was quite clever in that regard. But she made several crucial mistakes. Miss Marple ticked them off. She was too obviously pleased when you were arrested. She made comments suggesting insider knowledge of the investigation. And most damning, she reacted with moral outrage rather than simple jealousy when discussing Vivian. A wife jealous of her husband's co-star would express different emotions than someone who viewed Vivian as a moral threat. You read all that from her behavior. I've spent a lifetime observing people, Dr. Haydock. One learns to recognize patterns. Constance's pattern was one of moral superiority, masking deep insecurity. She couldn't allow anyone to question her respectability because it was the only thing holding her together. Inspector Slack arrived shortly after, looking somewhat chastened. "Miss Marple, I owe you an apology. I should have listened to your concerns about Dr. Haydock's guilt." "Not at all, Inspector. You were following the evidence as you saw it. Still, I arrested an innocent man while the real killer was free. If you hadn't intervened," he shook his head. "How did you know she'd bring poison to your gathering?" "I didn't know for certain, but I've observed that people who kill with poison often keep some on hand. It's their method, their tool." Constance had carried poison for 15 years, first to kill Catherine, then to kill Vivian. It was logical she'd have more, either for another murder or for herself if caught. You took a terrible risk, perhaps. But sometimes risks are necessary to prevent greater harm. Miss Marple's expression was gentle but firm. "Justice delayed is still justice, Inspector. Catherine Hartley deserved to have her murder solved, even 15 years later, and Vivian Ashford deserved to have her killer caught." After Inspector Slack departed, Miss Marple and Raymond sat in comfortable silence. Through the window, they could see St. Mary Mead going about its daily business, people shopping, children playing, life continuing as it always had. "Do you think the village will recover from this?" Raymond asked. "Of course. Villages always recover. People will gossip for a while, then something else will happen to capture their attention. Gerald Thornberry will eventually rebuild his life. Mr. Pemberton will finally be free of the shadow of Catherine's death. Dr. Haydock will return to his practice." Miss Marple smiled. "Life goes on, Raymond. That's what I've learned over the years. Even after the most terrible events, life finds a way to continue. And you'll go back to your garden and your knitting, pretending to be just a harmless old lady." "I am a harmless old lady," Miss Marple protested mildly. "I simply happen to have a good eye for human nature and a lifetime of experience observing it. These things come in useful sometimes." Raymond laughed. "Aunt Jane, you've just solved 2 murders and saved Dr. Haydock from the gallows. That's hardly harmless." "Well," Miss Marple conceded, "perhaps I'm not entirely harmless. But I am quite determined that wickedness should be punished and innocence protected. If that makes me dangerous to murderers, I can live with that." She stood, smoothing her skirt. "Now, I really must attend to my roses. They've been sadly neglected this past week. And this evening, I thought I might finally finish that cardigan I've been knitting for you. The green wool, you remember." "You know what I remember?" Raymond said, following her into the garden. "I remember thinking, years ago, that village life must be terribly boring for you. All those simple, ordinary people going about their simple, ordinary lives. Now I know there's nothing simple or ordinary about people, anywhere, and you've known that all along." Miss Marple picked up her pruning shears, examining a particularly stubborn, dead bloom. "People are endlessly fascinating, Raymond. They lie and love, betray and sacrifice, murder and save, all in the same small village, sometimes on the same day. The key is learning to see past the surface, to understand the patterns that drive human behavior. Is that what you do?" Look for patterns. Always. A woman who kills her sister out of moral outrage follows the same pattern as a woman who kills to protect her reputation. The details change, but the pattern remains. That's why wickedness is ultimately so predictable and why justice, properly applied, is inevitable. She began deadheading roses with practiced efficiency, and Raymond watched his elderly aunt work, marveling at the sharp mind hidden behind the gentle, grandmotherly FAQ aid. In the distance, church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to evening service. St. Mary Mead was settling back into its comfortable routines, the drama of murder already fading into the realm of local legend. But Miss Marple would remember. She would remember Catherine Hartley and Vivian Ashford, two women who'd died because they'd threatened someone's carefully constructed respectability. And she would remember that justice, however delayed, had finally been served. Sometimes that was the best one could hope for. 3 weeks later, St. Mary Mead had largely returned to its usual rhythm. The trial of Constance Thornberry was set for the new year, but the village had already moved on to other gossip. Mrs. Bantry's new hedge had grown into her neighbor's garden, causing a dispute, and young Miss Weatherby's niece was engaged to a solicitor from London. Miss Marple sat in her garden on a mild November afternoon, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she worked on yet another cardigan. But her eyes, sharp as ever, watched the comings and goings of village life with the same careful attention she'd always paid. Gerald Thornberry had resigned from the bank and moved away to Manchester. She'd heard where he hoped to start fresh, far from the scandal. Mr. Pemberton had finally seemed to find peace. His shoulders no longer bowed under the weight of 15 years of unjust suspicion. He'd even started dating Miss Weatherby. Much to the delight of the village matchmakers, Dr. Haydock stopped by most afternoons for tea, and their conversations had developed into a genuine friendship. Today, he arrived carrying a small package. "For you, Miss Marple, a token of my gratitude." She unwrapped it carefully to find a beautiful first edition of an Agatha Christie novel, The Murder at the Vicarage. "How thoughtful, Dr. Haydock, though I hope you're not suggesting I remind you of Miss Marple." He laughed. "If the shoe fits. Though I must say, you're rather more effective than any fictional detective. Miss Marple, in the books, sometimes stumbles onto solutions. You pursued yours with remarkable determination." "Oh, I don't know about that. I simply paid attention to what people were really saying behind their words. It's a skill anyone can develop if they care to observe human nature carefully." "Not anyone," Dr. Haydock said firmly. "It requires wisdom, experience, and a fundamental understanding of what drives people. You have all three." They sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping tea and watching the autumn leaves drift down from the trees. "Do you ever feel guilt?" Dr. Haydock asked suddenly. "About exposing Constance? She hang, you know, or at minimum spend the rest of her life in prison." Miss Marple considered this carefully. "I feel regret that human nature led her to such actions. I feel sorrow for Catherine and Vivian, whose lives were cut short. But guilt? No. Constance made her choices, Dr. Haydock. She chose to murder her sister rather than accept her sister's choices. She chose to murder Vivian rather than face the consequences of her first crime. And she tried to murder herself rather than face justice. At every turn, She chose to prioritize her own pride over human life. You're right, of course, but it's still sad, deeply sad. But that's the nature of human wickedness. It creates ripples of sadness that spread far beyond the initial crime. Gerald Thornberry is innocent, yet his life is ruined. Mr. Pemberton lived under a cloud of suspicion for 15 years. Vivian Ashford died seeking truth about her father. The consequences of Constance's actions spread much further than she ever intended. Do you think she ever felt remorse for killing Catherine? Perhaps initially, but I think she rationalized it so thoroughly that it stopped feeling like murder and started feeling like justice. That's the danger of moral certainty, Dr. Haydock. Once you convince yourself that you're on the side of righteousness, you can justify almost anything. Timothy Graves walked past on the street, waving cheerfully. He'd decided to stay in St. Mary Mead for a while longer, helping at the school while considering his future. The experience had matured him, given him a deeper understanding of human complexity. The young people handle these things better than we old folks do, Miss Marple observed. They haven't yet developed the rigid patterns of thought that can make us blind to truth. I wouldn't call you rigid, Miss Marple, no. Perhaps not in my thinking, but certainly in my routines. Tea at 4, gardening at 10, evening knitting by the fire. These patterns comfort me. She smiled, though I suppose they also make me seem harmless, which has its advantages when trying to observe people honestly. Mrs. Price hurried past, still looking a bit haunted by the events, but determinedly organizing the village Christmas pageant. Life, as always, marched forward. Will you tell me something? Dr. Haydock asked. When did you know for certain it was Constance? When I saw her deadheading roses with such violence, she was attacking them, you see, not pruning them. It was the physical manifestation of how she'd approached her sister, cutting out what she saw as diseased and wrong, with no thought to the pain she was causing. Roses, like people, can be imperfect and still worth preserving. That's rather philosophical. Gardening often is. One learns about life, death, growth, and decay in miniature. It's excellent training for understanding human nature. Raymond arrived in his car, having driven down from London for the weekend. He'd become a regular visitor since the case, finding the village more interesting than he'd ever imagined. Aunt Jane, Dr. Haydock, I've brought news. Constance Thornberry has confessed. She's given a full statement about both murders. The trial will be much shorter than expected. Miss Marple nodded. I thought she might. Once the burden of secrets is lifted, some people find relief in confession. She carried that weight for 15 years. Perhaps now she'll find peace, even in prison. Peace. Raymond looked skeptical. For a double murderer. Even murderers are human, Raymond. Flawed, broken, sometimes evil, but human nonetheless. We can condemn their actions while still recognizing their humanity. You're more forgiving than most, Aunt Jane. Not forgiving understanding. There's a difference. I don't forgive Constance Thornberry for what she did, but I understand the twisted logic that led her there. Understanding wickedness doesn't mean excusing it. It simply means recognizing the patterns that lead ordinary people to commit extraordinary crimes. As evening fell, they moved inside, and Miss Marple served dinner, a simple roast with vegetables from her garden. The conversation drifted to other topics: Raymond's work in London, Dr. Haydock's patients, village gossip about Miss Weatherby's romance, But after they'd left, and Miss Marple sat alone by her fire, her knitting needles clicking in the quiet house, she thought about Catherine Hartley and Vivian Ashford, two young women who'd died decades apart, connected by tragedy and the terrible logic of a murderer who believed she was doing right. Catherine had loved unwisely. Vivian had sought truth. Neither crime deserved death, yet both had paid with their lives. "Rest now," Miss Marple whispered to the empty room. "Your deaths have been answered. Justice has been served." Outside her window, St. Mary Mead settled into night. Lights flickered on in cottages. Families gathered for dinner. Children were called in from play. The village continued its ancient rhythms, undisturbed by the drama that had unfolded in its midst. Miss Marple finished her row of knitting and set it aside. Tomorrow there would be more patterns to observe, more human nature to understand, more mysteries, small or large, to solve. But tonight there was simply the fire's warmth, the cat's purring, and the satisfaction of knowing that wickedness, however clever, could not ultimately escape justice. For that was the true lesson of her long life. Human nature was complex, contradictory, capable of both great evil and great good. But patterns repeated, truth eventually emerged, and justice, properly pursued, would always find its target. She rose to draw the curtains, pausing to look out at her beloved village one more time. Somewhere out there, new stories were beginning, new loves, new betrayals, new secrets, and perhaps, someday, new murders. But Miss Marple would be watching. She would notice the small details others missed. She would recognize the patterns that repeated across time and circumstance. And she would, when necessary, ensure that wickedness did not triumph. For that was her gift hand, to see people as they truly were, beneath the respectable facades and careful lies. To understand human nature in all its complexity, and to ensure that, in St. Mary Mead at least, truth and justice would ultimately prevail. She settled back into her chair, picked up her knitting, and smiled. After all, there was always tomorrow, and tomorrow, one never knew what human nature might reveal.